Welcome to our listeners around the world to the Enlightenment podcast. We felt that there was a lot to talk about in general, and especially at this time, we feel that it's very important to have a dialogue on Palestine, particularly. My wife and co-podcaster here, Hanan Katan, is Palestinian. We wanted to build awareness and just reach as many people as possible. Today's episode, you've missed the first two, you've missed a treat. Please do catch up. But today we'll be covering the Great Palestinian Revolt, usually known as the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. Let's jump in. Hanan, what led to this revolt?
Yeah, I think, Shamim, let's go back to 1915 first. There was lots of intrigue and lots of secret negotiations, starting with Britain and France, that led to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So that's where they decided on how to partition the Ottoman Empire between them once they defeated it.
Okay, and Palestine was assigned to Britain under that agreement, which was made 2 years before the Ottomans were even defeated in 1918.
Yeah, but that was not what the British and the French promised the Arabs actually across the region. They enlisted and got the Arabs to help them fight the Ottoman Turks, and they promised them that they would give them their independence in return. But at the same time, those colonial powers, Britain and France, plotted among themselves to divide the area or the different areas between themselves and really forget about giving the Arab states their independence.
Wow, so they played both sides, and at the same time, Britain had also promised the Zionists, in return for their support, to have a Jewish national home in Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So the English always played every side, and sadly, the Palestinians and the Arabs overall were not used to this kind of level of political intrigue, and so they took the British their promises at face value, if you like.
So Britain then obtained a mandate to rule over Palestine from the League of Nations, that mandate, in 1922, and that lasted until the British left in 1948.
Yeah, and that's when a very large wave of European Jews went to Palestine while the British were sort of have taken over.
That period, yeah. As we mentioned in the previous episode, which was on Zionism, the Zionists wanted to set up a Jewish state in Palestine, and that idea well preceded the Holocaust, which started in 1933. Theodor Herzl officially founded Zionism in the 19th century, I think, in 1897.
Yeah, that was the official date, but it's really all started even earlier. So, for example, as early as 1870 till 1897, when the official Zionists were formed. So in those 27 years, you have the Zionists creating 20 Jewish towns in Palestine. So they already started.
Okay, and it, by all accounts, extremely well organized, well focused, with a very long-term view to achieve their objectives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They basically did whatever it took to achieve their plans at any cost. So, but the Zionists were, open about their goals, which involved ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And also, speaking of colonialism, I wanted to add that the Jewish Zionists in England, led by Rothschild, asked the Prime Minister at the time, David Lloyd George, for the Zionist project. So they were already working from England with the establishment to reach their goals, if you like.
Yeah, and in return, they said that they would support Britain during the war. And Rothschild, Weizmann, others played central roles in lobbying the British government throughout this time until we ended up with the Balfour Declaration, which happened in 1917. And that declaration, the Balfour Declaration, promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
Yeah, and the English pledged, or government pledged, a land that did not really belong to them, as we said, to European Zionist Jews. So it's like, we'll take your land and give it to somebody else.
Yeah. And of course, it's so ridiculous. But of course, the population of Palestine at this time was mostly Semitic Arabs, Muslim and Christian, with a small number of Semitic Jews as well. So let's talk about the Palestinian Revolt, which is the reason for this podcast. Why is it generally called the Arab Revolt and not the Palestinian Revolt?
Yeah, in episode 2, we mentioned Hasbara, which is really Jewish Zionist propaganda. And part of their propaganda was really, and still is today, is to erase the idea of a Palestinian identity. And instead of referring to Palestinians as Palestinians, they refer to them as Arabs instead, trying to change the landscape, if you like.
Mm. Yeah, because I was interested that when we traveled to Palestine and Israel during, not that long ago, in Israel the Palestinians are called Arab Israelis,
Yeah,
not
exactly.
Palestinians. So there is it's a very concerted effort, I think. We can call it historical revisionism if we want to be polite, but really it's an erasure. Naming is very important, and it's erasure of a people and a culture.
Yeah, and your ethnicity and your history, really.
Mm.
Uh, and even though the Palestinians were 98% of the population and they owned 96% of the land at the time, they still, that didn't really factor in.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's go with that. Leads us back to the Great Palestinian Revolt and what led up to it.
Yeah. So the Palestinian Revolt took place from 1936 to 39. Actually, my cousin Anne-Marie Jasser is doing a feature film on it. So I hope you'll see it when it's out next year. So as you can imagine, the Palestinians wanted their independence from the colonial English rule and from the Zionists who wanted to take over Palestine.
Sure. And under British rule, as we just said, the European Jewish influx into Palestine grew substantially in the 1920s. Um, and immigration is a hot topic right now, but this was not standard immigration. Generally, people come, they settle in, they're nice to the neighbors. What happened here?
Uh, so not that for sure. So we talked about in the last episode about the Jewish National Fund and others. What they did is they evicted Palestinians from their land, and the Palestinians, especially the farmers, had nowhere to live. So 2/3 of the indigenous Palestinian people were farmers around that time, and they ended up in urban Palestinian cities like Jaffa, which is known as Jaffa, and Haifa, and they end up in crowded shanty towns and impoverished, really.
Yeah. So naturally, the Palestinians decide to push back. What happens?
Yeah, many of the peasants who had been pushed off their land followed the teachings of Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam.
And but okay, Izzeddin al-Qassam was a Syrian who was originally dedicated to fighting French occupation in Syria and colonialism in general. And he ended up living in Palestine amongst the poor people in Haifa.
Yeah, he did build a large following in Palestine because he was anti-colonialist. And sadly, he was hunted down and killed by the British in 1935. And because of his popularity and because he cared and supported the Palestinians and their struggle, his killing led to further unrest in Palestine. So as an attempt to make Palestinian voices heard, then the Grand Mufti also of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, called for a general strike and that lasted from April to around October 1936.
Yeah, so a fairly peaceful form of resistance in a way, but this was completely crushed by the British, the English. Is that correct?
Yeah, not only the English, but also the Zionist militias who were trained and armed by the British to support them. So they're in cahoots.
Yeah. So the playbook that we see all over the Middle East still, the British and the Americans. So the Palestinian general strike, 1936, created enough hassle that the British decided to come and sort it out. A chap called Lord Peel set up the Peel Commission, also known as the Palestine Royal Commission, to find out what's the problem. Why is there all this tension between the Zionists and the indigenous Palestinians?
Yeah, but Peel figured out very quickly from his colonial perspective that the British mandate couldn't work. So instead, he recommended that Britain splits Palestine. And as you can imagine, not surprisingly, this caused a revolt by the Palestinians, further unrest, and this time around it was the peasant-led resistance movement that gained traction in Palestine.
Yeah, well, people who are losing their land. The Palestinians, so just to be clear, the Palestinians opposed this new idea of partitioning the country. Instead, what they wanted, which is what the the British had promised and subsequently betrayed was an independent state of Palestine that would be for everybody, that would protect all legitimate Jewish, Christian, other minority rights.
Yeah, exactly. But the English didn't care. And in around 1938, there was another commission that was set up by Woodhead Commission, I think it's called, to look at how to split the land. And that commission rejected the Peel Commission's plan because it required a huge transfer of Palestinian people and really ethnically cleansing them. But at the same time, in 1938, the Zionist underground movements were intent on taking over the entire country as per their agenda. And sadly, they had set off a lot of lethal bombs and across Palestinian markets and all across the country.
Okay. And then the English shipped 20,000 new troops into Palestine to join the troops that are already there. And they trained and armed more than 15,000 local Zionists, led by people like Ben Gurion. And these are groups like the Haganah, the Irgun, who were armed and trained by the British, correct?
Yeah, a few hundred Zionists were killed, but really over 5,000 Palestinians were killed, 15,000 badly injured, around 5,500 imprisoned, and 108 hanged. So really, what chance would the Palestinians have against all of this?
Well, I know the answer to that is not much. The majority of the Palestinian leadership on top of it, during all of this violence, was eliminated or exiled. Now, we mentioned the British and Zionist militias were working together. Can you just tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, I mean, there were terror groups. They were formed to create terror against the indigenous Palestinian population while committing atrocities to get Palestinians to move out of their land. So some of these terror organizations, like the Haganah, I think they were set up in 1920, the Irgun in 1931, the Stern Gag in 1940, and we can talk about them some more, but they were already starting and gaining a lot of followers and traction.
Yeah, but we said they're working with the British, but didn't they also target British forces in the 30s? Wasn't there a, famous explosion that killed British troops as well?
Yes, at the Camp David Hotel, which we'll talk
Yeah.
about. But
Which was
no,
the Irgun and Stern Gang, I think.
yeah, yeah. But during World War II, there was a truce between them because it served everybody's interests. And as I mentioned, by them working together, there was no chance for the Palestinians to win. And we've seen what the English have done in India, in Ireland, everywhere where they colonized. I mean, it was quite brutal. And by two sort of brutal forces working together and training those militias, the Zionist militias, with latest arms, weaponry, warfare, etc., it made it really very difficult for the Palestinians. We see it today with the UK, with the US, with Europe. That's exactly what they're doing: intelligence sharing, arms supplying, etc., etc. So it's just history repeats itself, sadly.
Yeah, which is why we thought it would be interesting to revisit these key moments of history because they are repeating themselves and they are very relevant to what's happening today. So the consequences of terrorizing Palestinians to try to clear the land, weakening their leadership, really deeply affected the ultimate outcome of 1948 and led to the Nakba, which we are planning to cover in more detail in our next episode. Sadly, that Nakba feels almost inevitable, that catastrophe, given what we've discussed here today.
Yeah, and I think whatever way people want to justify Zionism, it's really an ethno-supremacist ideology. It says very clearly that Jews must have their own state, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their land is acceptable to them to become the majority, the Jewish majority.
Yeah, and we're talking about the 1930s, but honestly, if you go on social media or some of the newer news outlets, not the mass ones that are serving often corporate or government interests, we're seeing the same ethnic cleansing today. Right now, there's mass starvation in Gaza used as a weapon, illegally against all of the conventions of war. And of course, the impunity now with which the attacks on Lebanon are indiscriminately killing and maiming civilians.
Yeah, I agree, but I have to believe that the crimes that continue to be committed against the Palestinians and sadly now against our Lebanese friends and family hopefully will continue to wake up the world about the injustice and the lack of humanity that continues to perpetuate in the area again and again, year after year, decade after decade. And I really hope the global South and the global majority really will step in to fill in the moral vacuum that we're seeing by the West.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, we are seeing, on a positive note, we are seeing students, we're seeing young people all over the world. We're seeing a lot of, Jewish people who are proudly, strongly Jewish, talking out against Zionism and filling in the definite moral vacuum that's being left by the media and politicians, and this assumption that an illegal occupation can somehow be construed as self-defense is slowly sort of crumbling, at least in public perception. That's about as positive as we can get after that, I'm afraid. But
Sadly.
as we as we wrap up for today, if you have any other questions or topics that you'd like us to cover, please do let us know. Leave us a comment. In the next episode, we will be covering the Nakba, the catastrophe for the Palestinian people of 1948. And if you enjoyed this talk and it taught you a little something, or you just found it fun and good and interesting, please do subscribe. I can't say fun, sorry. Please do share with your friends and family, because our aim for this podcast is very much to bring our point of view of humanism to as many people as possible. And with your support and help, we can do that.
Yeah, and also, as always, we believe that stories matter, representation matters in everything we do. Just to say thank you from the heart for taking the time to watch. Please subscribe, as Shamim said, and see you very soon.